Everyone, thanks for having us today. Super excited to be here, especially excited to be joined here by Kahini. And we have some pretty interesting topics to talk about with you today. Talking a little bit about how machine learning operations and what you need to think about in the space of machine learning as you develop new technologies, and especially in this new normal in kind of a pretty unique pandemic that we've never seen, and how it affects systems. So a little bit to introduce ourselves, a little bit about ourselves. My name is Diego Oppenheimer. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Algorithmia. Algorithmia specializes in what we call machine learning operations and management. And a little bit about my background. I spent most of the last almost 2 decades working in the data analytics space, specifically working at Microsoft, developing products like Excel, Power Pivot, SQL Server, so a lot of their analytical products. And I got my undergrad and grad school in data analytics at Carnegie Mellon out in Pittsburgh.
Hi everyone, I'm Kahini. I'm an investor at Gradient Ventures. I joined a year ago from business school at Wharton, but my background's in software engineering and product management, specifically in machine learning. Diego and I actually both graduated from Carnegie Mellon, so we share that in common, along with our love for MLOps. A little bit about Gradient. We're Google's early stage AI fund. We primarily do seed series A investments. And we operate independently for Google. We have our own fund structure. And since AI and ML are so ubiquitous now, we invest in enterprise, insurtech, fintech, healthcare. And of course, we're big fans of machine learning ops. We actually led Algorithmia Series A and have some other investments in this area, like Labelbox, which is the data labeling company, and Streamlit, which is an open source framework for data scientists to create apps. Next slide, please. So before we kick off to talk about MLOps, let's look at an overview of the investing dollars and landscape. So this is a report created by PwC and CB Insights. And what it actually shows us is investing has continued being strong. It's only a little bit below 2019 levels. And I think this is because the pandemic has really accelerated the trend towards digitization and more of this collaborative remote world. I mean, this trend is also evident from the fact that the NASDAQ just seems to be hitting new highs every day. Next slide, please. Last quarter, we saw really strong investing in digital health, fintech, and of course, AI. And if we double down in AI, it's verticalized solutions in different areas, but it's also enabling technology. So we're seeing more and more investments in infrastructure and MLOps. And just thinking about on the healthcare side, of course, COVID is accelerating telemedicine and remote patient monitoring. We're also seeing process optimizations from patient intake to taking physician notes using AI. Fintech continues to accelerate the adoption of cashless payments. Things are getting pushed more and more online. There's more pressure on cybersecurity using AI there for threat detection. And we're also seeing innovations as the entire banking infrastructure has to overhaul to support this kind of new normal.
Okay, so I have a question for you on this, on that one in particular. Like, do you see like types of companies that were not looking at AI before that are like more focused on it today that has kind of changed? Or is it a lot of companies that were kind of already on their journey now like kind of hit the accelerator because like the conditions are really needing to push forward on that?
Yeah, I would say it's more of column B. It's more an acceleration. I think the digitization, the adoption of cloud, all of this was happening. It's just happening faster. I think we're seeing most of that impact in sectors that still needed to be, were like further down that curve. So things like healthcare, supply chain, industrials, they're just having to push faster and stronger, and finance too.
Got it. So maybe this is a perfect segue into like how do organizations, I mean, there's a lot of SaaS startups and probably companies thinking, at this conference right now, like how do companies think about, adopting AI and ML, and more importantly, when you're assessing an investment, I'm kind of curious, how do you break down that mental process of like, what's there, what needs to be there, how is this going to go, apply to the business?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit different when we look at it from an investment standpoint versus a company standpoint, but thinking about it first from that company standpoint, right? We can look at where AI and ML really shine. So it's areas that require optimization or decision-making using things like prediction or classification, and then finally business models. And I know you're gonna talk a little bit more about this as well, but examples of optimization could be identifying ways to decrease energy consumption in an industrial process, right? And that could be anything from like oil and gas to a Kit Kat plant. Another example for business decisions is like prediction, right? Looking at your customer data, trying to figure out who's going to churn, and then targeting marketing campaigns accordingly. Another example could be using classification to build better risk models for insurance that are both more inclusive, but also better performing. So I think that's kind of the first step for an industry, just to assess current processes and see where ML can be applied. The second step is obviously to find a solution, and that could be using an existing SaaS vendor or building it yourself. But I think the most important piece here is to identify the key KPIs to really measure the ROI of the project, right? Are we looking for better speed, accuracy, cost reduction, or some combination of that? And then finally, it's rolling it out to the organization, and it's always a continued piece of work. But I think this is, again, where Algorithmia can absolutely shine when it comes to scaling and maintaining ML in production.
How do you think about, I'll ask the investor perspective on this. When an organization comes and said, hey, we're going to apply, so you kind of talked about like the best cases of applying ML to, like in terms of kind of defensibility of a business, what are the factors where, what's, using, Google's like Cloud Vision API is not exactly a competitive differentiator for anybody, right? Everybody can use it. So like, how do you assess kind of like when this is being applied to really some innovative part of the business that, is defensible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's technology innovation and then there's applied technology, right? And if we think about the applied technology piece, the business matters more. The product matters, how it lies in the competitive landscape, where the competitive advantage comes from. Is it access to better trading data? Is it like a new customer base that's being underserved, a new segmentation? So we look at that competitive landscape over there. And then finally, it's the go-to-market and how the company's really built like a delightful product that users really want to use. So it's a lot of, I'd say, similar facets to any other company when it comes down to that.
Got it. So if I could put a couple words in your mouth and tell me if you disagree, but like delivery matters, right? Like of all this, from an experience, from the KPIs, from the business, like essentially like the core of it is how this is being delivered, measured, and kind of in production actually ends up being like very important to kind of the entire process, which is kind of obvious, but a lot of people don't think about it that way.
Yeah, 100%. That is a great summary, Diego.
Perfect. Great. So, so I'll double down a little bit on what you said. So one of the things so we've been working in the industry for a number of years, and we help organizations get their machine learning models in production and work. It's really interesting because once you get double down and deep with organizations, we start kind of classifying the type of workloads and how they're applying machine learning to their businesses. And it's really interesting because, we talk about value, and, one way of thinking about it is like optimization, which is optimizing a current process that has usually anywhere between 2 and 10x of value, could be more, but like that's what we usually see. Improved decision-making can usually have between 10 and 50x of value. And new business model innovation is the one that, we can see up to 100x worth of value being generated, but it also is exactly with that kind of reward is the risk profile when you're taking on it. And so a lot of organizations want to go straight into, let's go create a whole new business model around ML, but the ability of actually doing that and actually getting it right becomes is very small, actually. Like, like it's a very complex, high risk, while there's a massive amount of improvement in what I call the boring ML, which is kind of on the optimization side. I don't find it boring, but I'm just kind of like, we see a general trend of organizations always trying to go for that free, let's go reinvent our business model, versus really focusing on 1 and 2, where there's like massive improvements that can be made. And it's kind of this like crawl, walk, run in the world of ML kind of approach. Is this something that you're seeing as well in terms of the industry trends?
Yeah, actually, something that I wanted to ask you is like, what is a good example for that business model innovation? I actually can't think of one from the top of my head.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. So I think, a completely, I think driverless cars, right, is a good, a complete new business model. Like, what's happening, like, if we think about the world of autonomous vehicles, like, does car ownership make sense anymore? Right? Versus leasing. Like, I mean, these are like tectonic shifts to economic models. Like, do we need parking lots? Right? Like, I mean, like, why would a car ever stop? Right? Why wouldn't it be always in circulation if it's not being driven by anybody? So I think there's like certain places in AI which are going to be like really, really transformational. Another good example of this could be in medicine. While we see today, and I believe you have even a portfolio company that's like, where it's human-assisted ML for radiology, really making radiologists like better at their jobs and helping them out. It's really not meant to replace them. But one could see a world where ML is being used to replace, to a certain degree, pathologists who are mostly doing kind of statistical and variable kind of calculations of environment and what's happening and kind of stuff like that, versus really being something that's more human-assisted. So I think there is like this potential for AI and ML to be like really change the game entirely for certain industries, but most of they're very rare, and they're probably a lot of somewhat years away. But we have tons of examples in this 1 and 2 category that can be, for business today, like completely transformational. But they fall more in the category of the boring ML that a lot of people want to do. But we've seen, as a good example around optimization, we've seen kind of like efficiency of deploying models in production using automation going from 12 months to 2 weeks, saving hundreds of hours of labor. From a decision-making process, we have a financial services fintech company who told us that they were able to increase 25% month over month revenue because they could actually produce loans in a faster way by automatically putting together like how they would actually qualify and disqualify credit decisions. And like that is, I mean, 25%, I don't know about, I'm sure you as an investor would probably be pretty excited on a curve if you saw 25% month over month revenue growth on multiple $1 million. So like these are quite, game changers, and where we see most of the action today in terms of building ML applications.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I think this slide doesn't need a lot of explanation here, but the new normal is a world of increased uncertainty and ambiguity. Even now, we can't predict the future. We don't know when we'll be going back to work, when it will be safe to have large gatherings. It's ambiguous, it's complex. So the question, Diego, here is how can machine learning really help in this type of uncertain situation?
Yeah, so we go back to the definition of what is machine learning. We're teaching machines, right? And to teach machines, we're essentially showing them previous patterns. But what happens when those previous patterns don't resemble anything like we've ever seen before? Things kind of fall apart in some cases, and you'll see it in the news that we've seen kind of like models gone wild, or like predictions not going in the right place. The rate of change, the volatility, the complexity, the signals, all of this is just pushing towards a world where if I have a model and I build it and I deploy it and I'm only doing that every 6 months, like I'm going to lose out on kind of a lot of nuance and like quality and kind of like a detail where things are just going to fall apart. So I need to start thinking about when I do approach and say, hey, I am going to have a predictive business. I am going to have a decision-making business driven by machines. How do I actually build out a process where I can very, very quickly iterate and work through that? And so we see like, you know, the type of response needed for this kind of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, you know, we see data science teams need to be able to work from home. They need to be able to access data from anywhere. They need to be able to quickly iterate on their models, especially in the kind of, you know, customers from anywhere. Like, how do you actually quickly respond to a new customer experience? How do supply chains, like, you know, change? I mean, like, let's think about what happened with, you know, Amazon and the supply chain as soon as this hit, right? Like, I mean, we were all going crazy going to get toilet paper. There's a logistical nightmare behind the scenes, but a lot of the organizations that were kind of driven by ML were able to quickly adapt to the new information that was coming in, deploy new models, and start actually working on that supply chain. And, you know, today we're not all rushing to hoard toilet paper from Costco anymore, at least not locally. I think there was some when I went. And so, you know, that's kind of the change there. And then, you know, there's different changes to risk, especially in fintech, where, you know, the governance rules are being changed, the standards are being changed, looking at payments, how are people being able to stay on top of payments? So the risk profiles from creditors and stuff like that is changing. So how do I quickly iterate through those changes? And then obviously on all of this, how do I provide that transparency and ROI back to the organization of how I'm doing it? So if I actually focus that from a technology perspective in how do I apply machine learning to these changes, you know, we want to move away from monolithic deployments of ML and one-offs to a much more rigid, developed process that allows for iteration. It's extremely important that speed to market gets taken into account. I mean, you know, we went through all of it. I mean, it feels like March was 3 years ago at this point. You know, we've gone through so much, and like that's the type of data and iteration that we're going through. We want it to be obviously compliant and risk. So how do I actually, you know, marry the idea of quick, rapid iteration with still strong controls and governance and auditability? And then at the end of the day, it's all about driving that ML value. We know that we can start seeing, you know, 10, 100x improvements on predictions and decision making if we get ML right. And we look at organizations like Google and Amazon and, you know, who have taken core machine learning to, you know, their businesses and everything they do, and they've become transformational in their industries. So like there's a good precedent for doing this right around that.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is in line too with some of the trends that we're seeing in the machine learning's ops space. Obviously started before COVID, but it continues to accelerate, right? Even for the adoption of ML and AI, we're seeing an expanding user base. So we're seeing even users outside data scientists being able to adopt this for business intelligence and making those business decisions that we were talking about earlier. We're also seeing repeatability around this, right? How do we reuse the models and everything that we've built? The second trend is somewhat unsurprising, but we're seeing a growth in community, and especially in open source community around machine learning and AI. It really just helps this technology gain that bottoms up adoption. And you touched on this earlier, but I'm probably most excited here about auditability and explainability, because I think as we see AI go into making those radiology decisions, self-driving a car, deciding about like fintech, who should get approved for a credit card and who shouldn't, it's really important to, number one, just audit what's going on, like what training data, what model, what led to a specific decision or inference. And I think Algorithmia provides some of that really important capability. And then it's making AI explainable, right? Pushing it a step further to understand what attributes of the data, what features of the model really led to a particular outcome, so we can ensure that it's fair and just. And I would also throw in a third one here, which is monitoring, right? Just continuously monitoring in production. And making sure it's secure, there's no model drift, stuff like that. I don't know, Diego, if you have something to add here in terms of trends that you're seeing.
Yeah, well, so, I think, MLOps comes from the world of DevOps, so it's machine learning operations. And so if you go back to the definition of DevOps, it was really around processes and continuous integration to deliver at a higher speed software at the same or higher quality. And so again, that goes back to why is there a trend, and there's this idea of machine learning operations, which is, I like how you broke it up, because essentially it's people, process, and tools. And the core of it is, how are we going to deliver faster machine learning at a higher pace, at a higher iteration, while never compromising security, auditability, quality, and stuff like that. And so organizations need to start saying, it's not only good enough that we go back to what we talked in the beginning, which is it's all about the delivery. And so it's not just about delivering once, we now actually have to iterate very quickly. We have a perfect example of a global pandemic on how fast we need to iterate. And so really building out what I call the rails of that continuous integration, continuous deployment, and high-speed highway of model iteration becomes important. And again, this is more people are involved, more tools are involved, more observability and understanding of why we're doing things becomes involved. And so all of these things kind of lead to, essentially why we need to start thinking about the machine learning lifecycle versus kind of like, let's just get one thing up and running. And so we kind of talk about, there's the development lifecycle, this is the machine learning lifecycle. We call it the 3-ring lifecycle. So there's a world of training and building out the models. And this is connectivity into data, tracking experiments, building out how do I actually got to the model that I'm going to be using. But then there's the life cycle of operationalizing this. And this is really where it becomes important, because this is what most of the organization is going to interact with. So how do I deploy a model? How do I manage those deployed models? How do I connect to those data services? How do I actually build the pipelines that are going to be do that in a scalable and repeatable way? Who's getting on call for those models when things go sideways? What's the infrastructure I'm using? Is that secure? How do I do monitoring? How do I do reporting? And then obviously, especially in enterprise, governance and security. We are now making core operational decisions for our business using automation. We need to have the rigor and the auditability and the regulatory compliance to be able to do that at scale. So thinking about how you're going to actually deliver this technology, how you're going to actually make sure that this isn't a one-way path, but actually something cyclical that's continually going, and building out your organization to be able to do that becomes important, because at the end of the day, all that matters is the delivery at the end of that actual inside prediction or our decision-making process. So the landscape, and just to kind of land it a little bit more technically, it becomes really interesting, because this is kind of what most machine learning teams are going to actually have to deal with, which is actually, I'm going to actually be building models in a whole bunch of different tools. That could be inside data robots, inside Jupyter notebooks, inside my Streamlit notebooks. I might be training models directly inside TensorFlow, getting them from my Spark. But then now that I have those models, and it's not a or, it's usually an and in most organizations, because the best tool for the best iteration. Now I actually need to go, how do I deploy that? How do I start building a model library for my organization? How do I manage all of these models in a consistent way? How do I pipeline them? How do I do the source code management around it? How do I provision APIs for it? How do I connect to the millions of data sources now that I need to do it? And so if you do one-offs, every single one of these becomes kind of essentially like a multiplication matrix of complexity. Every single one of these can potentially be a failure point in your system. So thinking about how you're going to scale from an operational perspective becomes super important. How is this tying to my business application processes when I'm customer facing? So you talked a lot about I better get this right, especially, especially if I'm in kind of medical ways, how am I integrating into infrastructure providers? And then when it comes to highly regulated industries like life sciences and medicine and financial services, there's a whole layer of regulatory data, InfoSec policy that needs to be applied to these processes. And these are things that usually, I'm not saying always, but usually data science team and machine learning teams are pretty not informed about, right? This is just not something that they've experienced, something they've had to deal with. So this actually becomes a point where a lot of teams kind of start losing out on the benefits because they can't get into production of, what they're doing. So starting to think about scale, thinking about repeatability, thinking about how I'm going to go do this with many models in many places, and expanding from there becomes a core part of what organizations need to think about in this, like MLOps. And again, just think about how quickly we need to iterate, right? All of this needs to happen so fast that, if you don't build for automation, for your automation, you're going to be stuck, probably pretty stuck there.
Yeah, and two quick things, Diego. One, I want to hear about how Algorithmia can help with this. And second, I think we only have a couple minutes left. I know we could talk about MLOps all day. We want to keep the schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kind of put it like, so like usually the explosion of tools means that you want to start bringing some standardization. So what Algorithmia is a connected platform for MLOps. We can integrate into almost any training workflow. We can connect to your data sources. We can register your model. We help deploy, run those pipelines either in as a SaaS service or in your cloud or on premises, run over those computational resources. But most importantly, we can actually monitor, report, and manage the infrastructure so that it can be called from almost any single language in any single application. So it's really about thinking about how do you really productize the MLOps experience of your organization for quick, rapid iteration. Because at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is getting these models into production so you can start getting value out of them. So how do we actually compress that timeline becomes the core thing that becomes so important. And that's what our software does and helps out with. But even just thinking about the process is super important for organizations. So typical like organization, you might actually see like, okay, we're going to build something in a Jupyter notebook, build a TensorFlow model, put that in Bitbucket, deploy that over a serverless GPU in AWS and call it from my Golang application. That's one. Imagine now I have to do this 100 times in your organization and I have to build this kind of train car path for every single one of these. So this is where the complexity really explodes. So start thinking from one-off, moving to platform, whether it be Algorithmia or whatever else you want to use, is super important. And it's all about repeatability, structure, and letting you go through changes really quickly. And then it's about bringing people in. To kind of wrap up our thoughts on this, which is just understand that there's a persona, and today existing workflows exist. There's development workflows that exist, and there's a DevOps experience that exists. And bringing in that data scientist, the ML engineer, the developer that's consuming the application, the DevOps person that's actually on call and with a pager in case something goes wrong, and then the business leader who cares about what the actual result is of these ML applications. These are all personas that participate in that, and this is how you can get to success inside your ML efforts. And going back to, again, why do we care about all of this, which is a lot of volatility, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of complexity, a lot of ambiguity, building processes for democratization, rapid innovation in a very, very, there is real value to be derived out of your ML efforts. And how do you do that in a secure and governed way? Starting thinking about how I can apply these to my ML initiatives is core for success, and why you'll continue investing in ML operated companies for a long time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to our session.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.